Good morning, and thank you for joining INSEAD's Coffee and Conversation featuring Milancy Harris. Now please welcome INSEAD's Executive Vice President, John Doyle.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for Coffee and Conversation. We're pleased to welcome one of our community's newest leaders today, having been sworn into office just this past February. Before we begin, let me make a few housekeeping notes. First, we hope to make this as interactive as possible. So we welcome your questions and ask that you please submit them through the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. We have more than 300 attendees in the virtual audience this morning, and we'll do our best to get to all of your questions. Second, we're pleased to welcome members of the press to the call today. So this is a reminder that today's program is on the record. And now it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker. Milancy Harris is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Combating Terrorism. In this capacity, she's responsible for overseeing the employment of Special Operations Forces in counterterrorism, military information support operations, information operations, unconventional warfare, irregular warfare, direct action, special reconnaissance, foreign internal defense, counterproliferation, sensitive special operations, and personnel recovery hostage issues as identified by the Secretary of Defense. Ms. Harris has 15 years of public sector service, including assignments as Chief of Staff for the National Counterterrorism Center and Deputy Director of the Emerging Issues Division at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. She also served at the White House as Director for Counterterrorism on the National Security Council staff. Prior to her current assignment, Ms. Harris worked on technology governance and institution building issues, first at Facebook and then as a founding member of the leadership team at the Oversight Board, which is a first of its kind initiative to provide independent oversight over Facebook's content moderation decisions. Milancy, welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thrilled to be here with you.
Well, we're pleased to have you. And before we delve into the mission areas you work and all those things that I just read that you're responsible for, let me ask you something about what happened to the Pentagon recently, and that is Deputy Secretary Hicks' memo about face mask guidelines. How is it to be working at the Pentagon now and not be required to wear a mask if you're fully vaccinated?
It's wonderful. I mean, after a year of only seeing half of people's faces and after starting in an office 3 months ago where I didn't know anyone, seeing people's smiles is remarkable. In a way, that took me by surprise. The good mornings, you can see people just kind of brighten in the hallways. I think it's a really nice feeling of, the road back to recovery and getting back to normal.
That's great. Yeah, I can only imagine. I haven't even worked in my office yet with my colleagues. I've been on the job for a little over a year now, and it's all been pandemic. So that must be just a great feeling to get to see people and look them not just in the eye, but see their whole facial expression again. So that's really exciting. And I think that was probably the most quickly implemented piece of guidance that's ever occurred at the Pentagon or something. I can only imagine the speed with which people were getting rid of their masks. So, but let me get back to your mission. The mission that you have a rather large remit in the position you're in as the Special Operations and Countering Terrorism. And so you were sworn into this assignment back in February, and we talked about all of the different the Special Operations Forces and all the mission areas that they're responsible for. Help us understand a little bit more about your job, if you could walk us through some of this and how you approach the responsibilities that you have in your position.
Sure. So as you might expect, every day in this role brings a different set of challenges and new opportunities, particularly across what is a really diverse set of portfolios. Fortunately, I inherited a really strong and experienced team. We are organized kind of in three main focus areas. There's the counterterrorism kind of policy focus. Then there is a kind of special operations, partnerships and strategy, irregular warfare team, and then there is an information operations directorate. And across that, any given week is a balance of quick turn issues from policy meetings and urgent taskings to kind of longer term work, like our regular warfare and information operations strategy and implementation work. And really every week kind of ebbs and flows between that and a variety of kind of oversight responsibilities we have for various programs. It is an incredibly diverse portfolio, but the kind of common thread through all of it is kind of the soft flavor and the functional nature of the work. And so as a functional office within OSD policy, I see a big part of my job as working with the regionals to bring our expertise and capabilities to bear on the problems of the day. And so a lot of it is partnering with those offices and figuring out the ways to kind of help bridge the issues and bring, what the special operations community has to bear on whatever problems or issues they are working.
Great. Well, why don't you, maybe a next thing to focus on is if you could just give us an idea of where you are as far as looking at the threats we're facing from where you sit. Can you give us a picture of the threat landscape and what is most concerning to you these days?
So I think we continue to see violent extremism organizations. I continue to actively aspire and seek to operate worldwide. I think what we see is that through the ideology, through the power of the internet, we see the offshoots and kind of the affiliates spreading in a way that looks a little different than the terrorism landscape did 20 years ago. I think while we've done quite a bit in the last 20 years to reduce the threat to the homeland, these groups still pose a threat to our citizens and interests abroad, particularly when you think about our embassies and presence. And have also grown increasingly savvy. I think they understand how to use the internet, they understand how to reach, they have incredibly effective messaging in some cases. And so I think when I think about the pressing concerns, I think less about a particular threat that concerns me and more about the fact that divided attention is going to be the order of the day as we seek to kind of pivot to kind of the challenges of 2021 and the great kind of power competition. I think for me, that means figuring out how to do counterterrorism in a resource sustainable way and how to do more with less and how to do two things at the same time. And I think a lot of that will require really, really looking back at the lessons of the last 20 years and how we've done the counterterrorism fight and how we should do it moving forward to be able to use the departments and the US government's resources to do more than one thing, but not necessarily allow the terrorism threat to grow.
Okay. Well, one of the changes we're seeing right now related to, the terrorism fight that's been ongoing for 20 years now, and even prior to that, is what we're seeing happening in Afghanistan. So as the military is changing its posture in Afghanistan and we're pulling out of Afghanistan, I would presume that our special operation forces are still going to be called to undertake some of the same missions, those counterterrorism or counterinsurgency missions and operations. But they'd have to do that from bases elsewhere in the region. So how are you looking at how to manage that task?
Yeah, so it is still a work in progress. I will tell you, we are working every day to make sure that we think through and take a really deliberate planning approach to the withdrawal. I think as we work to define what counterterrorism looks like vis-a-vis Afghanistan after the withdrawal, my emphasis is on scalability and responsiveness. I think it's going to be we're going to need to be positioned to adapt to whatever post-withdrawal Afghanistan looks like and whatever the counterterrorism landscape looks like. I think as we think about the capabilities that SOF have grown over the last 20 years and how they might apply it here, I think about it in three buckets: persistent engagement with partners and allies to ensure that kind of situational awareness and strong relationships so that they are in place depending on how the threat situation evolves. Increasing capacity to enable our partners and allies. And so I think about some of our counterterrorism partner development programs and some of the ways the department has spent time working on partner capacity. and then prioritizing the information space to shape the conditions. And so I think that's really where we want to make sure that we understand what's going on. We are using the full breadth of the US government's capabilities to bring to bear on this challenge, that it isn't just a kind of kinetic question in some of these cases, and that we don't allow this to become a kind of messaging hub as well.
A lot of things caught my interest there in that response, the not just kinetic piece, but also the partnership piece. And that makes me think about, you know, so much of the last couple of decades, we have been working very closely with our partners on multilateral counterterrorism efforts, of course, in Afghanistan, but in all of our theaters of operation. How do you see that developing or continuing, and what is the Department of Defense doing as far as leveraging our partners for fighting the terrorism fight abroad?
So I think we've seen collaboration on counterterrorism is a complicated landscape, like many issues, but we've seen very successful partnerships, I think, over this 20-year counterterrorism fight, and we've put a lot of priority into developing and growing those. I think some of our work in Afghanistan with our NATO partners best exemplifies how we've thought about this, because it is in some ways a very tactical partnership, right? So to increase interoperability between US Special Forces and conventional forces, we have standardized equipment so that we can work better together in that environment, and there is a kind of seamless integration when we are pursuing shared objectives. I think also we've emphasized a lot of shared training to ensure that there is tactics and techniques and procedures that are shared across kind of the SOF community outside of the United States. We see a lot of that led by the kind of NATO SOF headquarters. That is an effort that the US is a major stakeholder in, and which has kind of brought together those SOF forces from around the globe to learn from each other and do best practices. And those kind of partnerships then kind of come to bear in a very tactical way when operating together abroad. It's not exactly quick work, and so I think what it really requires is a little bit of patience and the willingness to put in the work. It has brought us great rewards, but in a lot of these cases, it's taken a significant amount of time to kind of grow the relationship, do the shared training, figure out exactly how best to partner with countries. But I think if that example in Afghanistan provides something that is easily transferable to other kinds of environments, and is something we emphasize as one of the things we do to kind of help build partner forces.
Well, let me continue the partner line, but also go back to the other piece, which is the not just kinetic. So can you say some more about the not just kinetic aspects of the terrorism fight? And also, I would think our partners, we're also engaging our partners in that area as well, for help in that area as well.
So I think from my perspective and from, kind of my corner of the Pentagon, right, I think of the building partner capacity as one of the biggest things we can do to bring a different set of capabilities to bear against the CT fight. I also think that we have an incredibly powerful set of tools at our hands with regards to information operations and the ability to counter some of the terrorist narrative that has grown over the last 20 years. We've seen these groups become incredibly savvy with the use of the internet and with the ability to radicalize from afar. And so I think credible narratives from the United States that counter some of the messaging and kind of appeals for support from these organizations is another place where we need to continue, I think, investing, but where we have seen, as we've grown more sophisticated, they have grown more sophisticated in their use of these tools. And so it is an area where we need to just maintain a continued commitment to evolving and understanding that threat landscape and how it plays into kind of that whole radicalization cycle and the recruiting pipelines and all of those types of things.
Well, as you look at all of the issues in counterterrorism, let me take a step back and reflect. So, we've had, like yourself, many new officials in government, and during confirmation hearings, CIA Director Bill Burns talked a lot about great power competition poses a greater threat to the United States than foreign terrorist organizations. And that was pretty much echoed when Avril Haines was up for her confirmation as the Director of National Intelligence. So with the shift in focus really to great power competition and with less of a focus on the terrorism mission, or at least the terrorism mission we've had now for 20 years, how do you see that shift going, and how is it affecting what resources that you have in your organization? And should terrorism still be a top priority?
So, excellent question. And it is, I think, a reality of today that terrorism is an enduring threat, but not an existential threat to the United States. And so this pivot to great power competition is completely justified. It is time to ensure that the US is best positioned to meet those challenges and to figure out the ways in which, for example, the Department of Defense needs to think about evolving the force to address those types of challenges and ensure that we are training and equipping to that threat environment. I think, for me, that means it's an incredibly important time to have this mission, because we have an opportunity to take all these lessons and figure out how to do CT with a little bit less and working a little bit smarter. I think we're not at a point where I can say that terrorism shouldn't be a top priority, but I can say it's not the only priority, and it should not be at this moment. I think as I think about, how that may affect my mission moving forward, I think we're going to see a question of whether or not we can do two things at the same time, whether some of the ways we are, doing partner capacity or stationed around the world, right, can help us meet great power objectives as well. And that's just not been part of the conversation to date, but I think it's a really important time to really understand what the kind of total laydown is and what objectives each kind of deployment or presence or program, what they serve. And that could be more than one. But I think for a long time, we've kind of treated CT as something that's over here, and this is where we're doing counterterrorism, and then here are the other kind of more conventional things. And I think what we're seeing is that landscape kind of come together, and a recognition that CT can't run the table, but we can't really afford to take our eye off that ball yet.
Okay. Well, I would like to say I'm noticing a lot of questions coming in, which is a great thing. And I think I want to go ahead and jump to one of the questions here, but also remind people, if you do have questions, please submit them using the tool on the right side of your screen. So the first question I have here is from a reporter with the New York Times, Eric Schmidt, and he asked, what is the status of the department's review of Special Operations Forces deployments worldwide?
So right now, as you know, we are undertaking a global posture review. So that will look at the total force, including soft forces. It provides a good opportunity, I think, to look at some of the issues that have been particularly acutely felt by our SOF. One is, kind of the deployment tempo and the lack of kind of dwell time and time to train, and kind of look at what the right mix is for the force there. And then I think also it will allow for kind of a global look at where SOF peculiar capabilities are needed, and where SOF really brings something unique to the objectives and are the tool that needs to be used. That review is ongoing and will, I think, continue here for the next few months, but is a real key priority for the department, and is working across all of the regional and functional offices within policy, which I think allows for a really diverse set of perspectives and conversations as we look at undertaking that review.
Okay. Yeah, and unsurprisingly, a lot of questions we're getting are about this, the great powers competition and the shift in resources and focus, and how you take special operations capacity, if you will, or the forces, and apply them to some of these other mission sets. So we have a question in from Matthew Levitt, who's with the Near East Policy, or the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And he asked, in what ways are the counterterrorism and a great powers competition priorities overlapping or even mutually reinforcing, especially when you look at the Middle East and Africa?
So I think when we look at the overlapping, I think what we need to think about most acutely is where we are either co-located or we are in an area that is of interest to one of our great power competitors. I think, as he correctly notes, right, Europe and Africa are two, or I'm sorry, the Middle East and Africa are two areas where we see an interest from our great power competitors in growing presence, in establishing their own bilateral relationships. And so I think in some ways the overlapping objective that can be serviced is really that partnership piece. In a lot of these countries, there remains a very acute terrorism concern. There remains a need or a desire for U.S. training, partner capacity building, resources in some capacity. And I believe that is something that helps us, I think, become that partner of choice, right? Maintain those relationships, and that gives us a little bit, I think, of a reach into those regions that is a challenge for those competitors. It also allows for us to have, I think, a presence where we can, as competition evolves, be strategically located and be positioned to address any kind of threats that may arise.
Okay. And continuing looking at regions of the world where soft forces may continue to be deployed and used. Mark Hazelton asked a question. He says, as we make a shift to great power competition, can you speak to priorities encountering influence operations executed by our major competitors in off theaters, if you will, like AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM? So thinking Russia, what Russia's doing and China's doing in the AFRICOM AOR or in the SOUTHCOM AOR and elsewhere. And he says, to what degree do you see the great power competitors looking to develop proxy fights to take our attention away from, say, the Indo-PACOM area or from Europe?
So I'll tackle the information part first. So I think we possess a range of information capabilities that help us generate narratives to compete against this kind of disinformation directed at foreign audiences. I think these capabilities allow us to both kind of act in a complementary manner with our other US government partners. We take a really kind of deliberate and comprehensive approach working with the Department of State to kind of increase our agility and capability to counter these narratives. I think we prize being able to build a narrative and communications that foreign audiences can trust, and a voice that can serve as a counterbalance to some of these competitor voices. I think the partnership and with the Department of State is super critical as we think about how to operate in an evolving information environment. I think we see our competitors, fighting us at all levels of the information fight. And really, I think that does involve using voices that aren't clearly necessarily Russian government voices or clearly, tied back to a competitor government. But I think what we mostly can do is try to counter disinformation and to try to do our best to present a whole of government voice that provides a counterbalance to some of these effects of misinformation and propaganda. What we see is that is an evolving environment. My time in the tech sector taught me nothing more than there are new challenges involving the information space every day. And so I think one of the things that we have really started to focus on is a way to bring the department's kind of information operations community together to really give some coherence to how we're looking across that, and to really maintain an approach that will allow us to evolve as the information space does, because we're seeing our competitors continue to iterate and to use new tools and to find new ways to challenge us. And so that culture of innovation, I think, in the department, and really trying to maintain a position on that cutting edge will be critical as we look to counter this.
Okay. Any thoughts on the second part of that question as far as sort of proxy fights? Do we see that? Is that something we see as more of an issue to be concerned about in the years ahead?
So I think when you talk about proxy fights, to, in the example, right, distract us from Indo-PACOM, I think what you see is these competitor countries using a variety of voices that don't all directly translate right back to a government kind of parent to challenge us. And I think some of that is the nature of the information environment, right? Not everything's going to come with kind of a Russian government stamp on it, or those types of things. And I think in those instances, the building the narrative kind of separate and apart from the individual actors will be most critical to maintaining a consistent and truthful, kind of US voice out there, as we see the variety of actors kind of diversify.
Great. Hey, we're getting a couple of questions related to open source intelligence. Some people refer to it as publicly available data. Others just talk about the internet. It's all sort of similar. But we have Kevin Burke ask a question, Mike Vetra. Let's start with Mike's. He says, how can the US use open source data or the internet information in the fight against terrorism?
So I think that in order to have a comprehensive kind of understanding of the information space, you cannot ignore the importance of open source information. I think we've seen that that has been a priority for SOF over the last probably 10 to 15 years. They've been on the cutting edge of developing open source kind of exploitation capabilities and understanding the value of that type of information. But I think the way that it fits into the total landscape is as a complement to, and does not replace the work that our intelligence community does. I think there's no replacement for a true all source kind of look at the terrorism problem set and understanding exactly all angles of it. But I think particularly in this era of a disparate threat, these groups growing and the reach happening over the internet, I think the importance of open source information and understanding that landscape and how information is distributed is incredibly important. And I think we've seen over the last 20 years the incredible impact that propaganda can have, that the recruitment videos and kind of the advertisements for the caliphate had in the growth of ISIS. And so I think we would be doing ourselves a huge disservice if we didn't consider that a critical body of information. But I think to really have the most nuanced understanding, it's best when you consider it kind of in that whole all source environment, and really does it the most justice, I think, then.
Some of your comments about recruiting and recruiting over the internet are making me think about an issue that many of us have been looking at very closely for the last couple of years, which is domestic terrorism. And of course, there's been intense discussions on this topic in the recent months. And President Biden said in his State of the Union address that domestic terrorism poses a greater risk to the homeland than foreign terrorism. And so from your seat as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Special Operations and Countering Terrorism, what is your perspective on this?
So as DASD SOCT, domestic terrorism really does fall outside of of my remit. But as a longtime CT professional, I have to acknowledge that we are in an incredibly challenging moment, and that the challenge that we face from this domestic terrorism threat is something that needs to be addressed, and that is getting, I think, the appropriate amount of attention from this administration. We now acutely know how quickly violent ideologies spread through the internet, and have an understanding of the cycle of radicalization that I think inform how we are approaching this moment in time. I think the parallels to the foreign terrorism problem set are important, but the differences are as well. And so I'm really heartened to see the new efforts that are starting at DHS and FBI. I think that there are ways to leverage the experts with the relevant experience to really look at this problem and tackle it from all angles. But what I think is exciting, to me, is that we are seeing a desire to learn from what we've learned from the last 20 years and see how it applies and see how it doesn't, right? And really puzzle through the ways in which this is a terrorism problem set like others we have faced, and the ways in which it is not. And I think as we continue to evolve the strategy, I think it will be an incredibly important undertaking. I think we cannot afford to just pretend it's not happening, or that this isn't a problem that the government should tackle. But I think the approach will look different than the one that I live every day, kind of looking at the foreign terrorism problem set. And I think that's probably the right solution.
All right. Well, going back to the foreign terrorism, we have some more questions about that. Some people want to know some specific issues they're interested in. And I'll give you maybe a couple of these together. So Jeff Selden asked, what parts of the world are most at risk for destabilization from groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda? Is there any surprises there? And then second, Rachel Thompson also asked about the changing CT environment in Africa, and what do you see as far as violent extremist organizations in Africa and the landscape there?
So I think unfortunately, my answer to that is not particularly new. We still see these groups having the best success in undergoverned kind of areas, or in countries where there is kind of tumult in the political situation. I think we see that Al-Shabaab remains a very concerted threat, and an organization that is both focused on threats to the region, but also threats to the United States interests, and so remains a concern when you think about Africa. We also see some of the places where the partner capacity, efforts are helping to build better approaches. I think we're seeing a growth in some of the regional responses when you look at kind of the response to the ISIS Mozambique attack, and how the regional partners are really looking to bolster Mozambique capability. I think you're seeing a lot of the same threats we've seen, but a little bit of a different level of response, or a little bit of a different approach, I think, from us on where the emphasis is. I think we are spending a good amount of time working to build kind of partners' capacity to find areas where we can work with countries to help counter these threats, ways the United States can help bolster some of these regional organizations. I think when we think about the ISIS problem set, we still see a concerted effort to regain a foothold. And we continue to have significant concerns about the radicalization at some of the IDP camps. But I think in general, we do not see the kind of territorial gains or any of those types of concerning developments. I think when we think about Al-Qaeda, I think we will see an effort to kind of reconstitute in some form or fashion. I think you have seen that there is a concerted effort in kind of reestablishing that organization. It'll it'll take some time, I think, for us to see what that really comes to look like. But the intent is there, and so it remains a concern as we, obviously look to different footprints in Afghanistan and other things. We want to make sure that at no time do we make any allowances for safe haven to take place. That remains one of our critical priorities as we look to the future.
Hey, here's a new topic that two different audience members have asked about, and it's in the category of threat financing and counterterrorism threat financing. And the first question is from Danielle Lindum, who's with the House Financial Services Committee. And Danielle asked, can you address U.S. SOCOM engagement on counter threat finance, especially in special ops and low intensity conflict context? As far as your coordinating role or activities. And so that's from Danielle. And let me slip down here to this other similar one, which is, I've lost it on my question queue here. Well, if I get back to it, I'll find it. But let's go with that one then, from Danielle Lindholm about sort of the threat finance piece, and where do you see that these days?
So we are a active participant in a variety of interagency forums that are focused on counter threat finance. I think we see that as a critical component to stopping the growth of these terrorist organizations, right? When you look at the way in which ISIS branches have grown, right, a huge part of stopping that growth is finding ways to counter the ability for them to be funded. And so it remains both a priority and a challenge, I think, for the government. This remains an incredibly complex landscape that is not an easy challenge to tackle, but is one where I think we recognize that it is a critical component to disrupting the sustainability of these networks over time.
Okay, I found that other question, and it is related. And I want to ask it because it's interesting, and perhaps a number of people are thinking about this with all the news about Bitcoin and Dogecoin and all the other cryptocurrencies out there, and digital currencies. How are those being used, or is there a concern over these new financial mechanisms, and how does that affect this idea of terror finance or terror recruiting efforts?
So unfortunately, I think I'm probably not your best coffee participant for this question, but I think we can't deny that the untraceability, the digital nature of this currency, I think, is something that we need to be thinking about, and we need to be working to understand how it is affecting this terrorist problem set. I think in some of these instances, we do not yet know, I think, in some form or fashion, how much this has switched. We see quite a bit of kind of off-grid finance in the terrorism space. And so the digital footprint that goes along with digital currencies may or may not, at least from my perspective, be a good thing. But I think it is one of the challenges of the day when we think about how the financing kind of landscape is evolving, and it is certainly something that I am confident my partners at Treasury are thinking through.
Okay. Here's something we haven't talked about specifically, and we have a question in from Simone Ledeen, who asked, where do you prioritize irregular warfare among all the various efforts that you're leading?
So I'd kind of go back to my initial remarks, right? When we think about like an average week in this job, there's like some portion of it that's kind of the urgent part. And then there is at least probably a third of the week spent on kind of this longer term kind of strategic planning for the department. And so irregular warfare was a key component of the 2018 NDS. And in 2019, there was an irregular warfare annex that was published. We see a common thread from that annex all the way through to President Biden's interim security guidance about the importance of the quote unquote gray zone and being able to look at the full breadth of kind of soft capabilities and how they might be brought to bear on that kind of gray zone conflict. And so what we have continued to do is prioritize what we call the implementation plan for that irregular warfare annex, which really is focused on getting the department to kind of get irregular warfare into the regular processes, into the planning and into how we think about conflict from day one. And so that remains a key priority for my office. It is also a place where we are not trying to just do kind of the long-term strategic, quote unquote, kind of like academic side of that work, but we are also considering and working with our regional partners today on ways in which kind of the full landscape of soft capabilities and what irregular warfare encompasses under doctrine can be brought to bear on the competition space.
Okay. And I don't think any conversation with a Defense Department official would be complete without a question about AI/ML. So we have one here from Corey Ash, who asks, could you talk about how AI and ML advances are impacting information sources and processing related to your mission?
So I think what you've seen over the last 20 years is a commitment to innovation from US SOCOM and our, US SOF. And I think what we have seen is a willingness to put those types of technologies into use and to experiment in the ways in which they can augment kind of our key mission. I think when we think about that technology landscape and how to do this, I think that for me is a key part of how we think about doing CT smarter and more resource sustainable, right? I think there has been a long history on the counterterrorism fight of doing things almost kind of by hand, right? There's like, what happens when you get all of this information? What happens when you collect things off the battlefield? And I think over time, we will see these technologies provide an enabling ability to get our arms around the immense amount of data that has kind of come to bear and that we need to be able to exploit to continue to do CT in the future.
Okay. I think we have time for one last question, Milancy, and that would be just as you look ahead at the year ahead, what are your top, the top 2 or 3 priorities you're really trying to tackle in the next year?
So I'd really like to, I think by the end of this year, have a solid understanding of how we're going to kind of fit the puzzle pieces of CT and great power competition together. I think there is always the, kind of tyranny of the inbox and the crisis of the day. But I think when I think about something that I would like to and kind of let like end of year timeframe understand is where we can credibly say we're doing this CT thing, but it also helps with these great power objectives, and have a better way to kind of talk about the use of the total force and where the CT kind of problem set fits into that. So that the question isn't, well, when are we going to stop doing CT? But I think the question is, how do we do that plus, plus, plus? I would also like to see us, one of our key priorities this year is to establish as Congress has asked us to do, the principal IO advisor, which is a key position in the department to kind of bring those threads together on the information operations problem set. And I'd really like to see, my office and kind of the information capabilities of the department get really integrated into a whole of government kind of approach on how we think about the information space and these challenges today. I think as we look back over the last few years and the ways in which we've been challenged by some of our competitors in the information space, like that is a critical component of this next year, is to figure out exactly how we better position ourselves and better understand all the tools in the toolkit so that we can be more reactive, I think.
Great. Well, hey, we've reached the end of our time this morning, but I will give you an opportunity if you have any closing thoughts or comments you'd like to share before we sign off.
I just want to thank everybody for taking time out of their morning. It's been a wonderful opportunity, and I really my thanks to you, John and INSA, for hosting these conversations. I have found them interesting as an attendee in the past, and I'm very honored to have been here this morning.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been terrific. We really value your candid insights this morning. So thank you so much, Milancy. And for everybody that's joined us today online, thank you as well for spending part of your morning with us. And looking ahead, there are a few things coming up I wanted to share with you. Next Tuesday, we will have a conversation with Melissa Smyslova, who's the acting Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at Homeland Security. And the week after that, on the 8th and 9th of June, INSA will hold its inaugural 8A National Security Showcase. And we hope you'll be able to join us for this program, which is going to provide a forum for selected 8A companies to present brief capability overviews of their innovative technologies or applications or services to the audience, but also to public sector decision makers and potential private sector partners. On June 16th, INSA will be hosting a leadership luncheon with the Director of the National Reconnaissance Office, Christopher Scalise. And then on June the 24th, we'll be having a panel discussion about remote work and the national security mission. And our panelists will be covering challenges and opportunities of remote work and how new technologies are enabling better and faster capabilities. We'll have other announcements in the days ahead. And as always, you can find a full lineup of our events on the insaonline.org, our webpage. When the webinar ends this morning, you'll see a short survey pop up on your screen. Please take a minute to answer the survey questions, as we truly value your feedback. And this concludes today's program. So stay safe and healthy, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you.